Sandra Garner and her husband John met in the small Texas town of Paris in the 1990s. Their relationship blossomed while working together at a packaging company. Despite their 13-year age difference, Sandra was older than John. They quickly found common ground and began dating. The woman had already experienced an unsuccessful marriage and had 2 children from her previous husband, Wes and Andrea, but this did not prevent the couple from falling in love with each other. Although at first glance their relationship seemed perfect, fate was preparing many trials for them. After 2 years of dating, John and Sandra decided to get married. Their wedding took place in Las Vegas on January 1, 2000. John turned out to be a wonderful stepfather to Wes and Andrea, as well as a loving and caring husband to Sandra. He was friendly and sociable, easily made friends and made a good impression on those around him. However, those close to him knew about his problems with alcohol, which manifested in aggressive behavior when intoxicated. In addition, John had some psychological disorders that he tried to tame with antidepressants. At work, John held the position of personnel manager. He was responsible for hiring new employees and layoffs. The latter function seemed to bring him particular pleasure. Colleagues noticed how John reveled in his power over people at such moments. But despite this, in everyday life he remained a pleasant family man who sincerely loved his wife. Initially, John and Sandra's marriage was quite happy. The husband quickly got along with the children, especially with Wes. The relationship with Andrea was more difficult, since the girl needed time to accept a new father. But this is a normal psychological reaction of a child to the appearance of a stepfather or stepmother in their life. In 2014, Sandra began to suffer from symptoms of multiple sclerosis. This disease significantly complicated the life of the woman and her family. Now John was responsible not only for the emotional well-being of his wife, but also for housekeeping and daily care for the sick woman. During this period, Sandra tried to work remotely in order to somehow help the family financially. John readily took on new responsibilities. He supported his beloved in everything, helped her cope with daily difficulties. Daughter Andrea, seeing the stepfather's selfless care for her mother, finally felt sympathy for him. She began to help John take care of Sandra, which brought the whole family closer together. But Sandra's illness was progressing. The woman suffered both physically and emotionally. The prescribed medications only partially alleviated the burden of the disease, while suppressing her psychological state. During periods of depression, Sandra searched the internet for ways to take her own life. One day she confessed to her husband that she wanted to commit suicide so as not to be a burden to him. John replied that he would follow her out of life. These words made the woman rethink the situation. She realized that she had to live for the sake of the children, for whom John was now their only support. Eventually, Sandra had to quit her job because she could no longer perform her duties either in the office or remotely. John remained the only breadwinner in the family. Despite financial difficulties, he did not show his concern, continuing to support his wife and children. In 2016, the Garners moved to the town of Maple, located 50 kilometers from Dallas. This small, cozy community of no more than 1,000 residents became the ideal place for them to live. The family even bought a house here. John's relatives also settled next door, so the Garners often held joint holidays and parties in the backyard of their home. By that time, the children had already grown up and lived separately. Despite the progressive disease, Sandra felt relatively well. At least until 2018. On January 1st, the couple was supposed to celebrate their 18th wedding anniversary. They invited their son Wes to a celebratory dinner at a restaurant. The daughter could not join because she was away. Wes went home around 7 p.m., while John and Sandra, as always, went to bed between 9 and 10 p.m. They did not suspect that a terrible tragedy awaited them that night. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, Sandra called the 911 rescue service. The woman begged them to send the police and an ambulance, because her husband had just been shot. According to her, an unknown assailant took Sandra to the bathroom and ordered her to count to 100 before calling the police, otherwise threatening to kill her. The frightened woman followed the attacker's instructions. Sandra told the dispatcher that her husband was still showing signs of life, although wheezing. She asked for help to save him. The 911 operator instructed the woman over the phone on how to perform artificial respiration while the patrol was on the way. But it took the police about 15 minutes to get to the Garner's house. When the officers with body cameras entered the bedroom, they saw Sandra loudly calling for help. The woman dragged her husband from the bed to the floor to give him artificial ventilation. The police officer, examining the body, noted that John was still warm, but no longer breathing. Probably, the man died shortly before the arrival of law enforcement officers. This was also confirmed by the ambulance medics who pronounced the death of 42-year-old John Garner. The officers suggested that the attacker might still be in the house. They searched the entire house, but found no one else. The killer, it seems, fled before the police arrived. Sandra was in a state of shock and could not communicate with the investigators. She was given first aid so that the woman could calm down. Meanwhile, a forensic group arrived at the crime scene. Experts carefully documented all the evidence. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Sandra came to her senses. She was taken to the police station for questioning. Investigators took samples from the woman's hands to check for gunpowder and other traces of the shot. They also seized and photographed her clothes. Sandra's testimony was extremely important for the investigation. Despite her illness and nervous exhaustion, the woman tried to describe the events of that night as accurately as possible. She said that the attack occurred shortly after she and her husband went to bed. Due to the stress and suddenness of the events, Sandra could not make out the attacker. The woman only remembered her own fright. According to Sandra, the shot that woke her up around 0:40 was not the only one, another one followed. In the bedroom, the woman saw a stranger with a flashlight and a weapon in his hands. Frightened, she jumped out of bed, hid on the floor and began to shout, hoping for help. The attacker, dressed in a blue sweatshirt, jeans and a mask, was much taller than Sandra. Begging for mercy, the woman heard from the attacker that he came to take revenge on her husband and had no intention of harming her. The stranger said that he once worked hard in the company where John was responsible for hiring staff. Despite this, he was fired a few years ago. Having lost his home and confidence in the future, the man harbored malice towards John. In addition to revenge, the robber demanded to give him the savings from the safe. Sandra led the villain to the closet, near which she was able to see his face without a mask. But as soon as the woman tried to remember his features, the attacker threatened to kill her if she did not stop. The frightened Sandra had no choice but to look away and no longer look at the robber. Opening the safe, she handed him all the money available there, about $18,000. The exact amount the woman could not name, because she had not counted the money for a long time, but remembered that the last time there was exactly that much. The police, of course, had no way to verify the veracity of her words, so they had to take Sandra at her word. After that, the attacker took Sandra to the bathroom, ordering her to count to 100 while he escaped from the house, and only then call the police. The interrogation at the police station lasted more than an hour. Finally, the exhausted woman was released home, where relatives were already waiting for her, ready to support her in a difficult moment. Sandra, apparently broken by grief, did not evoke sympathy in some of the relatives. It seemed to them that her sadness was only a pretended game. Sandra's behavior really seemed strange. Having just finished talking with the police, she immediately returned to her own house, not at all afraid that the robber might return. On the contrary, it seemed that the woman was hoping for this, intending to shoot the villain herself. Meanwhile, other family members arrived at the house of Wes, Sandra's son. Hearing from them about the murder of his stepfather, the shocked guy immediately went to the police station to talk to the investigators. It was strange that he did this without even going to his mother and not calling her to find out how she was feeling. Later, the police understood what prompted Wes to act this way. He had to tell them something extremely important. From the first words of the young man, it became clear that he suspects his own mother of the murder. But, despite the confidence in his guesses, Wes felt uncomfortable testifying against his closest person. He expressed doubt that the attacker could imperceptibly penetrate the house, because there lived 2 dogs that would certainly have barked, warning the owners of the danger. This testimony surprised the police. After all, from the very beginning of the interrogation, Sandra's story sounded coherent and convincing, without arousing any suspicion. But Wes insisted on his mother's involvement in the crime, forcing the investigators to consider such a version of events. Law enforcement officers scrupulously examined the crime scene, not missing a single corner in the house and adjacent farm buildings, garages and sheds. In Sandra's car, a Ford Mustang, which was parked in the garage, they hoped to find her personal pistol, which the woman usually kept with her for self-defense. As Wes said, most often the weapon was lying in Sandra's purse or under the car seat. However, this time the gun was not found there. Instead, a real arsenal was found in the Garner's house itself, 49 pistols and 10 rifles. As it turned out, John was an avid gun collector. However, he did not keep his exhibits, as expected, in one place, but scattered them around all the rooms, so as to always have a pistol at hand in case of danger. It seemed as if the man was aware of the risk of an attack from enemies and prepared for it in every possible way. Only one specimen was missing from this impressive collection, a Taurus .38 caliber revolver registered to Sandra. Perhaps the woman had lost it due to health problems or the gun had simply been stolen. Traces of gunpowder were found on Sandra's hands, albeit in a small amount, which in itself did not indicate involvement in the crime. After all, gunpowder gases could get on the woman's skin when she was near her shot husband or during attempts to resuscitate him. So, although the gunpowder particles found on Sandra's hands were evidence, and indirect at that, her behavior still aroused a lot of suspicion. Now the police considered the woman as a probable suspect in the murder of her own husband. During the search, law enforcement officers seized the couple's computers, tablets, and mobile phones in order to study their correspondence and search query history. Indeed, in Wikipedia's search engine in Sandra's name, they came across several rather strange queries, such as about fentanyl and other potent drugs. Even more suspicious were the woman's searches for ways to kill and conceal traces of a crime, made shortly before John's death. However, there were not so many such requests to unambiguously indicate malicious intent. In addition, they were lost among Sandra's usual, everyday searches. And yet, these finds added arguments in favor of the woman's involvement in the murder of her husband. On January 4, 2018, investigators actively developed a version of Sandra's guilt. The only obstacle remained the absence of her gun. So the police again turned to Wes. He noted, if he himself were looking for his mother's weapon, he would first look into her car. The investigators decided to implement this advice, planning another, much more thorough search of the car and garage. Arriving at the Garner's house, the police found the garage locked. To get inside, they asked Wes to bring a spare key. The young man went for it to his mother, who was in a neighboring house surrounded by relatives. But as soon as the son informed Sandra about the intention to let the investigators into the garage, she reacted surprisingly emotionally. She dropped her fork, began to beg Wes not to let the uninvited guests in and drive them away. This scene shocked everyone present. Until then, Sandra had cooperated with law enforcement, not interfering with the investigation. So a sharp change in her behavior could not but alert relatives. Indignant, the woman began to accuse relatives of suspecting her. After that, Sandra ran out of the house and headed to the garage, intending to personally prevent the search and drive the detectives away. But in vain. The investigators stated that they would conduct an inspection with a court sanction despite her disagreement. So in the end, Sandra had to give in and unlock the garage door, otherwise the police would simply break them down. As soon as the investigators got into the garage, they immediately looked under the driver's seat in Sandra's Mustang. There, in an ordinary grocery bag, wrapped in a paper towel, lay a rusty .38 caliber revolver. This unequivocally indicated that during the initial search, the weapon was hidden somewhere, and then returned to its usual place. The police officers who took part in both searches were 100% sure of this. Now Sandra's nervous behavior and her desperate attempts not to let investigators into the garage became clear. The officers talked to Wes again. He said that he saw with his own eyes how his mother hid the murder weapon in the car after the police left. But Sandra herself denied her son's testimony. But the strangest thing was that the woman seemed to have no motive to kill her beloved husband, who took such selfless care of her. Investigators decided to interrogate Sandra again, but this time already as a suspect in the brutal murder of her own husband. She was immediately made to understand that all the evidence pointed to her involvement in the crime. The police put significant psychological pressure on the woman, accusing her of lying and trying to confuse the investigation. Sandra was nervous from the very beginning of the interrogation. She wept bitterly, rejecting any guilt, sincerely trying to prove her innocence. The suspect insisted that she did not hide the weapon in the car. Now it was up to the ballistics experts. They had to prove that the fatal shots were fired from the revolver found in Sandra's car. Comparing the found bullets with the weapon, the experts confirmed their complete correspondence. However, neither Sandra's fingerprints nor traces of her DNA were found on the revolver. So it is quite possible that anyone else could have used it. Despite this, the collected evidence was already enough to arrest Sandra and formally charge her. But the investigators understood, in order to prove her guilt in court, it was necessary to fill in the gaps in the evidence base. They came to arrest the suspect in the house where she lived with her late husband. Since Sandra was not there, the police decided to wait for her return. When the woman drove up in her Mustang, she was shocked by the fact that the law enforcement officers immediately twisted her arms and put on handcuffs. The deceased John's relatives watched the arrest of the mother from the windows of the house opposite. And as soon as 55-year-old Sandra was put into a police car, they all applauded. Later, family members admitted, at that moment they felt the triumph of justice, being certain that it was this woman who shot their loved one. Sandra was placed in custody, with bail set at $2 million. But the suspect did not have that kind of money, so she was stuck behind bars for a long time. On March 21, 2018, Sandra Garner was formally charged with the murder of her husband John. This was followed by a grueling year and a half in prison, which had an extremely detrimental effect on the health of the sick woman. Appearing before the court in the city of Waxahachie, Texas, in September 2019, Sandra looked completely emaciated. It seemed that the time spent in captivity had sucked the rest of her life force out of her. Physically exhausted and emotionally drained, the woman still hoped to prove her innocence. At first, the prosecutors were sure that the collected evidence would be enough to sentence Sandra to a long prison term. But the deeper they delved into the details of the case, developing a prosecution strategy, the more obvious it became, due to the indirect nature of the evidence, the defendant had every chance to avoid punishment. One of the most interesting witnesses in court was Wes, Sandra's son. It was he who so readily helped the investigation to expose his own mother. He even hinted that the weapon should be looked for in her car, although nothing was found there before. This seemed suspicious to experienced investigators. Usually the one who possesses a large amount of information about a crime is involved in it. So many in the courtroom involuntarily had logical questions. Could Wes have wanted his stepfather dead? Was it he who arranged the murder in such a way that the sick mother would end up behind bars, and not himself? And everyone who asked themselves these questions was inclined to an affirmative answer. The more carefully the jurors analyzed Wes's personality, the more terrifying the picture seemed. This young man really had the opportunity to kill his stepfather. He freely used everything in the couple's house, knew where John and Sandra kept the weapons. As it turned out, even the suspicious internet search queries that were attributed to Sandra were made only when Wes was staying overnight at his parents' house and waited for them to fall asleep. So it is quite likely that it was he who was behind those requests. But most alarming was how decisively Wes tried from the very beginning to convince everyone of his mother's guilt, pointing to her weapon. This looked like a bold attempt to frame a loved one. In addition, the young man's alibi turned out to be very unreliable. Wes claimed that on that fateful night he was at home and watching videos on his laptop. But no one could confirm his words, because the young man lived alone. Moreover, during the first check, the police did not pay attention to one notable fact. Wes's computer had a different time zone set. And the guy could have turned on continuous video playback, and then left the house. It turned out that he essentially had no alibi. Instead, he had a motive. Wes was mentioned in John's will, so he could well strive to take possession of his stepfather's inheritance as soon as possible. The jurors also took into account that Sandra, on the contrary, had no visible reasons to wish her husband's death. John occupied a colossal place in her life. For years he had been caring for his sick wife. He was the only breadwinner of the family. The couple lived peacefully and happily. Separately, the court noted the not-too-professional actions of the police. First, they took a full 15 minutes to get to the crime scene. Secondly, the officer, who was investigating such a serious case for the first time in his life, made several annoying mistakes at the scene. In particular, law enforcement officers failed to properly fence off the territory from outsiders, which could have lost important evidence. As it turned out, the police made a whole series of procedural mistakes. For example, they should have immediately put special bags on Sandra's hands after her detention to preserve possible traces of gunpowder for further examination. But this was not done. Moreover, the photos from the crime scene, taken by one of the officers on his own smartphone, were later accidentally deleted and irrevocably lost. Investigators also did not work too carefully on the version of the involvement of one of John's former colleagues in the murder, although Sandra mentioned, the attacker hinted that he was fired from the company where her husband worked, and he harbored resentment because of this. But instead of a large-scale survey of all former employees of the company, the police limited themselves to conversations with several witnesses, then rejecting several promising versions, in particular about the likely revenge of someone from John's ill-wishers. Investigators preferred to focus on the murdered man's inner circle. So first of all, the prosecutor had to fend off the defense's accusations about the negligence of the police during the investigation. The state prosecution emphasized, although with some delay, the Garner's house was still closed to outsiders, and everyone who theoretically could have penetrated there on the night of the murder was thoroughly questioned. Regarding the violations made by individual law enforcement officers, official investigations were conducted, and the guilty were punished. The prosecutor, in particular, had to explain to the jurors why the experts did not take fingerprints from the Mustang door handle, in the cabin of which the weapon was found. After all, it is quite possible that traces on the car were left by the real killer, who planted Sandra's revolver there. And if it really was her son, then he could freely enter his parents' house. The domestic dogs knew Wes and would not have made a fuss. But there was one significant flaw in this version. Wouldn't the mother have recognized her own son, by his voice, his eyes? Sandra answered this by saying that on that terrible night she was extremely frightened and confused. Besides, multiple sclerosis prevented her from concentrating properly and noticing details. And Wes, they say, deliberately spoke to her in a changed voice. However, during the trial, Sandra stated, now, looking back, she still tends to think that it was none other than her own son who shot John. According to her, recently the son behaved strangely, very distant from his stepfather, with whom he never had a close relationship, as between a stepfather and a daughter. And after the trial, mother and son stopped communicating altogether. At the same time, the daughter still supports Sandra and believes in her innocence. The police did not stop trying to prove Wes's guilt and for some time continued to consider him as the main suspect in the murder of John Garner. But it was too late, precious time was wasted, important evidence was lost, the necessary investigative actions were not carried out on time. So now the prospects of reliably establishing the identity of the killer are almost ghostly. The materials of this high-profile case have been gathering dust in the archives for many years. It seems that no one will ever return to it. And this means that the murder of John Garner is highly likely to remain unsolved forever. On May 30, 2010, a tragic event occurred that forever changed the life of one Peruvian family. Stephany Flores, a 21-year-old student and avid poker player, went to another tournament at the Atlantic City Casino in Peru's capital city of Lima. The young woman had remarkable success in poker and very recently hit the jackpot, winning $10,000. So she was full of optimism about her chances of victory in this tournament. As a responsible daughter, Stephany informed her father Ricardo that the trip would take a couple of days, after which she would definitely return home. However, that return never happened. Stephany lived with her dad, and their family had an outstanding reputation in Peru's high society. Ricardo Flores was not only a successful race car driver but also ran for president of the country. The Flores couple had 5 wonderful children, 4 sons and the youngest daughter Stephany, whom everyone loved immensely and surrounded with care and attention. Despite their elite status and considerable wealth, the Flores family lived a simple and happy life. Stephany's brothers dedicated themselves to organizing various events, while Stephany herself, studying in her 3rd year of the business administration faculty at the University of Lima and helping her brothers, became passionate about gambling, which brought her a solid income. A day passed, then a second, but Stephany still did not return from the poker tournament. Her father sounded the alarm. This was not at all like his responsible daughter. Ricardo began calling his sons, asking for their help in the search. The brothers also could not contact Stephany. They checked all her friends, drove around the entire area, but found no trace of the girl. In desperation, Ricardo Flores turned to the police. Law enforcement officers went to the hotel where the ill-fated poker tournament was held. The hotel staff could not shed light on where one of the participants had gone. Then the detectives began to study the footage from the CCTV cameras. In the footage from the hallway near the conference room where the tournament was held, they noticed that around 3 o'clock in the morning on May 30th, Stephany went inside and joined a young man in light clothing at the table. The couple communicated pleasantly during the tournament, and around 5 a.m. they left the hall together. Hotel employees remembered this couple. The young man seemed polite and pleasant to them, and one of them even noticed that the stranger had an outward resemblance to Hollywood actor Brad Pitt. But the main question that worried the police was where these two went after the tournament. The answer was found in other camera recordings. At approximately 5:16 a.m., Stephany and her new acquaintance entered room 309, which was registered to him. After some time, the man left, returning with 2 portions of coffee and pastries. And exactly 3 hours and 20 minutes after the first visit to the room, he left again, this time with a backpack on his shoulders, and did not return. Before leaving, the guest asked the hotel staff not to disturb the girl in the room, which was done. The policeman decided to personally check if everything was all right with Stephany. The door to the room was not locked. But when the detectives crossed the threshold, a horrifying scene opened up before their eyes. Stephany Flores lay dead on the bed. Her body was covered in blood, the girl was literally beaten to death. A bloody tennis racket lay nearby, the probable murder weapon. An expert established that death occurred from a blunt force trauma, which caused massive bleeding in the brain. The girl's neck was broken, blood flowing from her nose, ear, and the left side of her head. There were signs of strangulation and injuries to the back of the head and neck. Stephany was fully clothed, no signs of sexual assault were found. So that motive was immediately discarded. Instead, the police had a theory that the murder occurred during a robbery, because all of Stephany's money, credit cards and jewelry had disappeared. And the amount was considerable, about $15,000. $10,000 of which the girl won in poker, and $5,000 she took to buy her father a new laptop. After reviewing the camera footage, the detectives already had the main suspect, the very same young man with whom Stephany was last seen. Room 309 was booked in the name of 22-year-old Joran van der Sloot, a citizen of the Netherlands. And here's where things got most interesting. The police found out that Joran was already on the international wanted list. It turns out that 5 years ago, on May 30, 2005, under extremely similar circumstances, another girl disappeared on the island of Aruba, an American named Natalie Holloway. And the main suspect in that case was none other than Joran van der Sloot. This information made the police suspect that the Dutchman could be a serial criminal. The arrest of the dangerous murderer became a matter of utmost importance. He was declared wanted throughout the country. While an active search for Joran was underway, investigators delved into studying the case of Natalie Holloway's disappearance 5 years prior. They hoped to find clues that would help track down the suspect and understand who they were dealing with. Natalie Holloway, the first child in the family, was born in the small town of Clinton, Mississippi, USA, on October 21, 1986. When she was only 7, her parents decided to divorce. Natalie and her siblings remained under the care of their mother, but continued to maintain warm, friendly relations with their father. At the age of 14, Natalie's life underwent more changes. Her mother remarried, choosing a successful businessman. The family moved to the stepfather's estate in the elite Mountain Brook area of Alabama. Despite all the upheavals, Natalie continued to study diligently, was a member of sports team support groups and dance clubs. Her efforts were not in vain. The girl graduated from high school with honors and received a full scholarship to study at university. It seemed that endless opportunities and prospects were opening up before her. But one trip to warm lands changed everything forever. In May 2005, 18-year-old Natalie, along with a group of graduates, went on a dream vacation to the Caribbean island of Aruba, an overseas territory of the Netherlands located in the southern Caribbean Sea. Aruba, which is part of the island group called the Leeward Antilles, or the Dutch Caribbean, is considered one of the safest places in the region, with an amazingly low crime rate. The graduation trip was organized by Natalie's school. A total of 124 happy students went to the island, accompanied by 11 teachers. The vacation was all-inclusive at the wonderful Holiday Inn Hotel. It is worth noting that the consumption of alcohol is allowed in Aruba from the age of 18. The daily routine during the vacation was rather monotonous, but pleasant. The young people enjoyed a carefree life, waking up whenever they pleased, having fun, sunbathing on the beach, swimming in the crystal-clear blue sea. After a hearty lunch, some could afford a nap. And in the evening, everyone gathered for dinner, after which they went to have fun in the casino or bar, where they tasted various cocktails, including alcoholic ones. May 29, 2005 was the last day of the heavenly vacation. The only thing that distinguished it from the previous ones was that everyone was packing their suitcases before leaving for home. Natalie, like the rest, packed her things, placed her passport next to her suitcase, and went to dinner. After dinner, the company split up, some continued the fun, while others went to their rooms to get a good night's sleep before the morning flight. At dawn on May 30th, students and teachers gathered in the lobby of the Holiday Inn for the checkout procedure and transfer to the airport. But during the roll call, it turned out that one student was missing, Natalie Holloway. No one from the group knew where she could be. The teachers tried to call her room, assuming the girl had simply overslept, but no one answered. Then the school representatives, along with a hotel employee, went to her room and opened the door. To their surprise, Natalie was not there, but all her belongings remained in place, including her suitcase and passport. The hotel staff and accompanying teachers were literally standing on their ears, trying to find the girl. They searched the entire territory of the hotel, but in vain, not a trace of Natalie. Around 11 a.m., one of the teachers called the missing girl's mother and informed her about the disappearance. When asked if Natalie could have gone somewhere alone, the woman answered with a categorical denial, her daughter would never have done that. Convinced that Natalie had been kidnapped, the mother was beside herself. She immediately contacted her husband and the girl's father to tell them about the tragedy. Without wasting a minute, the whole family went in search of their daughter, taking the first flight from a neighboring city. Natalie's mother also reported the incident to the 911 service and the FBI. Upon arriving in Aruba, the relatives began an active search, enlisting the support of the local police. They handed out photos of the missing girl and questioned everyone who might have seen Natalie at the hotel or at the resort. The investigation established that the girl did not spend the night in her room on the night of the disappearance. Moreover, she did not return there at all after dinner. However, Natalie's friends reported an interesting detail: they saw her communicating in the hotel casino with a tall, blonde young man, probably Dutch. It was assumed that the girl could have gone somewhere with him. After the casino closed at midnight, the security saw Natalie sitting at a table with 3 guys. The staff of the establishment recognized this company, because the young men often appeared there. They were 17-year-old Dutchman Joran van der Sloot, 21-year-old Deepak Kalpo and his 18-year-old brother Satish. The police reviewed the CCTV footage, which confirmed the words of the security guards. The footage clearly shows Natalie sitting at the same table with Joran, after which the whole company went somewhere. Casino employees described van der Sloot as a professional hunter for young wealthy female tourists, whom he scammed for money. At that time, Joran was only 18, he lived in Aruba with his parents. The young man came from a decent family, his father worked as a lawyer and was preparing to become a judge. Joran was considered a promising athlete and was an excellent student at school. Everyone predicted a brilliant future for him in football. But in his teens, problems with behavior began. The young man became a frequent visitor to bars and casinos, abusing alcohol. It was van der Sloot that all the collected evidence pointed to. Natalie's parents, along with the police, went to the Dutchman's home to talk to him. A grey Honda was parked near the house, in which Natalie was last seen. Joran's father said that his son had gone to the casino of another hotel. Law enforcement officers immediately headed there, but the young man's trail was already cold. While everyone was getting to the suspect's house, his father called the police and said that Joran and his friend Deepak had already returned home. When the detectives arrived at the scene, the friends were separated and interrogated separately. Their testimonies not only contradicted each other, but also constantly changed. At first, both claimed that they had not seen the missing girl at all. But when the policeman demonstrated the video recordings, in which the young men were clearly communicating with Natalie, Joran instantly remembered that he had met her that evening. According to him, after the casino, Natalie asked him to go with her to a club. Joran agreed and took his friends Deepak and Satish with him. They had a great time, drank and danced. Then they drove the girl back to the hotel, where a security guard allegedly began to harass her, which was the last thing the Dutchman supposedly saw. No one saw Natalie again. But the police already knew it was a lie. Camera records refuted the version about Natalie's return to the hotel. Investigators arrested the guys several times for false testimony, but they were released without charges due to lack of evidence. With each new interrogation, the suspects changed their stories. Now they claimed that after the club, the 4 of them went to the lighthouse to look at the ocean, and then went for a walk on Ayrshire Beach. What happened next? Joran van der Sloot firmly stood his ground. He claimed that it was his friends who left him and Natalie on Ayrshire Beach. According to him, the girl was so drunk that she kept passing out and falling, so in the end he left her alone. The Dutchman was allegedly in a hurry, because the next morning he had to be in class. And Natalie did not want to leave, wanting to have a full blast on the last night, and gave him permission to leave her. Van der Sloot assured that he had no idea what happened to her next. But now, looking back, he allegedly regrets leaving the girl alone, because she disappeared. The young man claimed that he and Natalie only kissed that night, and there was no intimate relationship between them. However, his friends told a different version. The Dutchman had fun with the American and then left her on the beach to her fate. The police thoroughly searched the alleged crime scene, but found no clue as to Natalie's whereabouts. Unexpectedly, a gardener from a nearby hotel provided new information. The man said that he saw Joran, Deepak and Satish digging a hole that night when the girl disappeared, in a vacant lot near a pond. Law enforcement officers immediately went there, drained the water from the pond and dug up the entire area, but in vain, nothing suspicious. Time passed, but no one was charged, and Natalie Holloway remained missing. Her family was extremely dissatisfied with the course of the investigation, blaming the police for incompetence. The relatives sincerely believed that Joran was involved in the crime, and pressure had to be put on him to extract a confession. But for some reason, the police did not do this. The Holloway family even announced a reward of $250,000 for information about Natalie's whereabouts, and also promised $100,000 to someone who would return the girl alive. Local residents began to massively call the police, sharing their guesses and assumptions in the hope of receiving a reward. However, this did not help the search at all. The police accused the parents of the missing girl of the wrong approach. They claimed that because of the promised money, investigators began to be distracted by details irrelevant to the case, which only harmed the investigation. At the same time, Natalie's relatives did not give up, continuing to post posters, hand out flyers and take part in the search for their daughter. Aruba was under tremendous pressure from the Holloway family, who demanded the immediate arrest of the suspects, even despite the lack of evidence. All this only complicated the work of the investigation. At one point, Joran, Deepak and Satish were in custody for 3 weeks. Locals already thought that they would be charged, but they were mistaken. The guys were released. True, Deepak and Satish got out faster, but Joran spent 2 more months behind bars. At some point, the Kalpoe brothers told the police that Van der Sloot's father helped his son hide Natalie's body. The man was immediately arrested, but in the absence of evidence, they were forced to release him after 3 days. Moreover, Joran's father, being a lawyer himself, sued the Aruban police for unlawful detention and was awarded $40,000 in compensation from them. The case of the disappearance of the American graduate student gained considerable media attention in the U.S., which greatly embarrassed the island authorities, because the lion's share of Aruba's income depended precisely on tourists from the States. The increased attention to the incident was caused by the persistent desire of Natalie's parents to achieve justice for their daughter and stir up the police. And Joran van der Sloot himself also had a hand in this. He willingly gave numerous interviews to American TV channels, receiving money for it. With obvious pleasure, the Dutchman told how he met Natalie and the details of their evening together. The young man assured everyone of his innocence and non-involvement in her disappearance. A year after the incident, van der Sloot returned to the Netherlands, where he continued his studies. In an interview with local media, he complained that they wanted to frame him. He claimed that he honestly left Natalie Holloway on the beach that fateful night and went home. After 2 years, Joran, together with a journalist, even released a book about the girl's disappearance, in which he told his version of events, insisting on his own innocence. The young man made good money on all this hype surrounding the tragedy. Under the relentless pressure of the Holloway family, the police still dared to search van der Sloot's house and the surrounding area. They carefully looked through every nook and cranny in the house, dug up the entire yard, but did not find a single piece of evidence that would shed light on this dark story. The whole world closely followed the course of the investigation, especially in the USA, Aruba and the Netherlands. Joran turned into a media persona. Some suspected him of involvement in Natalie's disappearance, while others believed in his innocence. The young man himself continued to appear on various talk shows. In one of these TV shows, unable to withstand the pressure from the host, van der Sloot threw a glass of drink right in the journalist's face. 3 years had passed since Natalie Holloway's disappearance when new information emerged. As it turned out, one of the witnesses saw Joran and his father near the pond at 4 a.m. that fateful night. The young man allegedly ran up to a nearby fast food restaurant, and a few minutes later the 2 men got into a red Jeep and drove away. At the same time, an old lead surfaced related to van der Sloot's ex-girlfriend. She told the police how one night, while on the beach with Joran, she heard a chilling phrase from him: "Who knows, maybe now you are next to someone who is able to get rid of a corpse." These words seriously frightened the girl, because she was convinced that an innocent person would never say such a thing. However, despite numerous clues, hints and constantly changing stories of the suspects, the local police believed that there was still not enough evidence to press charges. So the cases against Joran, Deepak and Satish were closed. Investigators stated that they were ready to reopen the proceedings only if new significant details appeared. So, no one was ever officially charged in connection with Natalie Holloway's disappearance. It seemed that van der Sloot was simply enjoying his impunity and dubious fame. In 2008, a recording appeared on the internet in which the Dutchman described Natalie's death in detail. He was secretly filmed with a hidden camera by one of the journalists. In the video, Joran claimed that he was with the girl on the beach, where they had sex. After that, she allegedly suddenly began to shake and fainted. So he asked his friends to take her body out to sea in a boat and throw it overboard. Later, another recording was published on the internet, in which van der Sloot literally rejoiced that Natalie's remains were never found. He claimed that otherwise he would have been fried in the electric chair. The young man also hinted that someone helped him get rid of the body. But the strangest thing was that he got away with all these antics. The Aruban police did not take his confessions in front of the camera seriously, stating that this was not enough for the court. To bring van der Sloot to justice, it was first necessary to find the body and physical evidence, which the investigators simply did not have. Law enforcement officers believed that with his flashy statements, Joran was just trying to gain fame and make money by inventing these creepy tales. Some time later, van der Sloot even ended up in a psychiatric clinic, where he sought help of his own free will. After that, he went to Bangkok, the capital of Thailand. With the money earned from interviews and book sales, Joran van der Sloot bought a small restaurant in Bangkok and started his own business. That same year, while in Thailand, he gave an interview to another journalist. During the conversation, the Dutchman confessed that he sold Natalie Holloway into sexual slavery, and divided the money he received with the Kalpo brothers, who helped him in this scheme. Moreover, Joran said that he was sending Thai women into slavery to the Netherlands, earning $30,000 for each one. However, after the interview was over, he called the journalist and stated that it was all just a bad joke. Van der Sloot's behavior seemed extremely inadequate. The interview caused Joran problems with the local authorities. The police began to investigate the information he voiced about the trafficking of Thai women. In the end, fearing the consequences, he was forced to flee the country, abandoning his business. However, he later managed to sell the restaurant. Soon Joran's father died of a heart attack, and the young man began to blame himself for it. He ended up in a psychiatric hospital again due to a nervous breakdown. After being discharged, van der Sloot faced financial difficulties and decided to get money in a new way. In 2010, the lawyer for the Holloway family stated that the Dutchman had contacted him under a pseudonym and offered a deal. For $250,000, Joran promised to reveal information about the location of Natalie's remains, and demanded an advance of $25,000. The investigation established that these messages were sent by none other than van der Sloot. Natalie's father agreed, brought $25,000 in advance to Aruba and handed it over to Joran in person. The young man's story changed again. Now he claimed that he pushed the girl when she wanted to leave. Natalie allegedly fell, hit her head on a stone and died instantly. And then Joran and his father buried the body under the foundation of a house. Van der Sloot insisted that it was an accident, and he was not to blame for anything. The Dutchman even indicated the place of Natalie's burial. However, the police quickly found out that this was another lie. The mentioned house was built even before the girl's disappearance, so it could not be the place where the body was hidden. After this meeting with Joran, the father of the deceased received an email from him in which he admitted that the story was completely fabricated. The Holloway family began to work closely with the FBI to gather evidence against van der Sloot and bring him to justice, at least for fraud and extortion. In the end, a criminal case was initiated. Upon learning of the extortion charges, Joran fled to Peru. It was there that the tragedy with Stephany Flores occurred. On June 3, 2010, the Dutchman's ex-girlfriend called the police and reported where he could be found. It turns out that Joran asked her to lend him money for a plane ticket, and she decided to turn him in to law enforcement. Van der Sloot was detained in Chile, where he arrived from Peru in 2 taxis and planned to fly away by plane. During the arrest, the police noticed that the suspect's clothes were stained with blood. Obviously, while fleeing, he did not even have time to change. Joran was extradited to Peru and charged with the murder of Stephany Flores. At first, van der Sloot denied his involvement during the interrogation. According to his version, armed robbers burst into the hotel room, stole valuables, and shot the girl. Joran himself allegedly miraculously managed to escape, and the victim's blood got on his clothes during the shooting. Of course, the police did not believe this story. There were no armed attackers on the CCTV footage. No one heard the shots, and most importantly, the girl was not shot. For days after his arrest, van der Sloot finally confessed to the crime. Joran said that at first everything was fine. He and Stephany went into the room and had a nice conversation. But then he noticed that the girl got into his laptop and came across information about the Natalie Holloway case and his possible involvement in her disappearance. The young man began to convince Flores that it was a misunderstanding, he had nothing to do with it and was innocent. However, the frightened Stephany did not believe a single word he said. She slapped Joran in the face and tried to escape from the room, which caused him to have a furious fit of rage. Van der Sloot pounced on the girl, hit her on the nose with a tennis racket, and then began to strangle her. There was blood everywhere, including on his shirt. To muffle the victim's screams, he took off his bloody clothes and put them on Stephany's face. Joran only stopped strangling the girl when she stopped showing any signs of life. Subsequently, he claimed that he regretted what he had done, blaming everything on alcohol and the aggressive behavior of Flores herself. He claimed that he was just afraid that she would go to the police, so he committed this impulsive act, losing control. However, investigators believe that in fact everything was much simpler. Joran killed the girl for selfish motives, in order to seize her money and valuables. Realizing that he now faced a long imprisonment in Peru, the Dutchman tried to make a deal with the investigation. He promised to indicate the location of Natalie Holloway's remains in exchange for dropping all charges. But this trick did not work. Van der Sloot's trial did not last long, because all the evidence was against him. CCTV cameras recorded how Joran entered the room with Stephany, and left alone. The victim's blood was found on his wrist, and his DNA was found on the victim's body and the murder weapon. The defense simply had nothing to object to, so the defendant, on the advice of his lawyer, pleaded guilty. The lawyer promised that this way he would not get more than 15 years. But everything turned out differently. The court found Joran guilty and sentenced him to 28 years in prison. In addition, the killer was obliged to pay the family of the deceased Stephany $75,000 in compensation. Dissatisfied with the verdict, Van der Sloot began to accuse his defender and the police, who allegedly forced him to confess. After serving his sentence in Peru, Joran was to be extradited to the United States, where another trial awaited him, for fraud and extortion of money from the Holloway family. While serving his term, in 2014, the Dutchman met 33-year-old accountant Lady Figueroa, who came to the prison to sell sweets and cigarettes. A romance developed between them, and soon the couple decided to get married. Subsequently, they had a daughter, whom they named Duzia van der Sloot, after Joran's grandmother, Trudy. Thanks to the liberal rules of imprisonment, his wife could visit him twice a week. She portrayed her husband as the kindest person in the world. However, in 2020, Van der Sloot divorced Lady for the sake of a 24-year-old girl named Eva. The new passion managed to charm Joran, and together they were even involved in smuggling prohibited items into the prison. When this was exposed, the Dutchman had another 7 years added to his sentence for distribution. After this incident, he was transferred to a stricter regime institution where visits with visitors are prohibited. However, Joran continues to maintain contact with Eva and other girls who write him letters. Interestingly, Van der Sloot has still not received official charges in the case of Natalie Holloway's disappearance. This case remains unsolved. Despite this, Natalie's relatives are convinced that it was Joran who was behind her death. It seemed obvious to everyone that a trio was involved in this horrific story, Van der Sloot and the Kalpoe brothers. These guys were known as hunters for the money of wealthy American female tourists, whom they skillfully scammed. The main role in these scams was played by Joran, because he was fluent in English, had an attractive appearance and knew how to conquer a woman's heart. The Kalpoe brothers were more in secondary roles. The Holloway family is convinced that Natalie also became a victim of their insidious machinations. Probably, Joran planned to swindle money from the girl, but did not intend to kill her. That fateful night, something went wrong. Perhaps Natalie refused to give the cash or valuables, and the thieves failed to rob her. During an argument, the girl died, and they, in order to avoid responsibility, got rid of the body. Most likely, Natalie was thrown into the ocean to feed the sharks, which helped the villains to cover up the traces of the crime. Or maybe something even more horrific happened, and the girl was killed on purpose. The confidence in such a course of events only strengthened in the Holloway family after the news of Joran's brutal murder of Stephany Flores. After all, these two cases are strikingly similar. Van der Sloot met both girls in a casino, went with them, and then ruthlessly killed them. At first, the Peruvian authorities agreed to extradite Joran to the United States only after he had fully served his sentence for the murder of Stephany. But in May 2023, they changed their decision. Now the Dutchman can be temporarily transferred to American justice for charges to be brought, and then returned back to Peru. Such haste was caused by the advanced age of key witnesses in the Holloway case, who may not live to see Van der Sloot's return after many years. In fact, the U.S. State Department expressed the hope that Joran's temporary extradition would bring long-awaited peace to the missing girl's family, who are suffering just as much as the Flores family. The suspect himself was categorically against it and tried to challenge this decision through lawyers, citing the fact that he was not notified in advance. But all his appeals were rejected. At the end of May 2023, Van der Sloot was taken from a Peruvian prison under heavy escort. A special FBI plane, sent specifically for his transportation, delivered the suspect from Peru. On June 8, 2023, the plane with Joran van der Sloot on board landed on U.S. territory. The Dutchman was immediately transferred to a prison in the city of Birmingham, located near Natalie Holloway's hometown. So far, the exact date of the start of the trial of Joran in the case of extorting money from the missing girl's family remains unknown. In addition, it is still unclear whether he will be officially charged with involvement in the disappearance and probable murder of Natalie herself. This is a complex and confusing case that will likely remain one of the most mysterious crimes of the 21st century for a long time to come. However, despite the absence of direct evidence, the Holloway family is unwavering in their conviction. It was none other than Joran van der Sloot who had a hand in the tragedy that happened to Natalie that fateful night in Aruba. His friends, the Calpo brothers, probably also played a certain role in this horrific crime. After all three were well known as hunters for the money of gullible girls, ready for any vileness for the sake of profit. And if Deepak and Satish usually remained in the shadows, then Joran was always in the foreground. Attractive, witty, a dexterous manipulator who knew how to gain trust and take possession of a woman's heart. So it is quite likely that Natalie also fell victim to Van der Sloot's insidious plan. Maybe at first he only wanted to swindle money from her, but something went wrong. Most likely, the girl guessed his true intentions and refused to give cash or valuables. An argument flared up between them, in the heat of which Natalie, unfortunately, died. Frightened by their own cruelty, Joran and the Calpo brothers decided to hide the traces of the crime. Most likely, they threw the lifeless body of the girl somewhere in the ocean, hoping that after some time not a trace of it would remain. Perhaps local sharks also contributed to this. But it is also possible that Natalie Holloway became a victim of a carefully planned murder. And the suspicions of relatives about this only intensified after the tragic events in Peru. After all, there is a striking similarity between the deaths of Natalie and Stephany. In both cases, Joran van der Sloot met the girls at a casino, spent time with them, and then ruthlessly killed them. At first, the Peruvian authorities were going to extradite the Dutchman to the United States only after he fully served his sentence for the murder of Stephany Flores. But in May 2023, they suddenly changed their decision, agreeing to a temporary extradition. Van der Sloot will be handed over to American Themis for charges to be brought, and then will return to Peru to continue his term. The Peruvian authorities were pushed to such a step by the advanced age of key witnesses in the Holloway case, who may simply not live to see the release of the criminal. The U.S. State Department even expressed the hope that this extradition would bring long-awaited peace to the family of the missing girl, who are suffering just as much as the loved ones of Stephany Flores. Upon learning of this decision, Joran was categorically against it. Through his lawyers, he filed an appeal to the court, referring to the fact that he was not notified about the extradition in advance. But all these attempts were in vain. Van der Sloot's complaint was rejected. At the end of May 2023, the Dutchman was taken from a Peruvian prison under heavy escort. The FBI sent a special plane to Peru to transport the suspect. On June 8, 2023, it landed on U.S. territory with Joran on board. Van der Sloot was taken to a federal prison in the city of Birmingham, Alabama. This is very close to Natalee Holloway's hometown. Now everyone is waiting for Joran's trial to begin in the case of fraud and extortion of money from the Holloway family. But so far there is neither an exact date nor official charges in the disappearance and probable murder of Natalee herself. It seems that it will be very, very difficult to finally unravel this horrific tangle. For almost 20 years, the death of the young beauty from Alabama has remained one of the most mysterious and high-profile criminal stories of the 21st century. Natalee Holloway's relatives courageously continue to search for truth and justice, not losing hope of punishing the guilty. And the main suspect for them still remains Joran van der Sloot. Of course, it will be extremely difficult to prove his involvement in the tragedy due to the lack of direct evidence and the victim's body. But, given the chilling coincidences between Natalee's disappearance and the murder of Stephany Flores, it is possible that American justice will also find weighty arguments against the Dutchman. In the eyes of the Holloway family and the whole world, Joran has long since turned from a suspect into a real monster, cold-blooded and ruthless. Whether he will receive the deserved punishment for his crimes, time will tell. But few doubt that this person is a true embodiment of evil in human form. And society must be reliably protected from such predators. Christmas is a magical time when the whole family gathers together, especially if some relatives come from far away, from other countries. People enjoy the company of their loved ones and revel in the holiday cheer. But unfortunately, this time is not filled with light and joy for everyone. Sometimes terrible things happen, as in this story, where the main character was 26-year-old Elle Edwards. On Christmas Eve 2022, Elle was celebrating with friends at the Lighthouse pub in Liverpool, UK. The girl stood out with her bright appearance and beauty. She worked as a beautician at a local beauty salon and also assisted at a dental clinic. Elle had a natural kindness and positive energy, which allowed her to easily find common ground even with the most demanding clients. In addition to her attractive appearance, Elle had also achieved a high professional level in her fields. The girl radiated cheerfulness and always greeted people with a smile. At the same time, she was a purposeful person, constantly moving towards her goals and dreams. On December 24, 2022, Elle's sister, Lucy, flew in from Dubai to spend Christmas and New Year's with the family. Elle was eagerly awaiting her return. Deciding to celebrate the long-awaited reunion in style, the girls went with friends to a local pub called the Lighthouse. At the establishment, the company had a great time, they laughed a lot, danced to the music, and sang karaoke. The atmosphere was filled with fun and no one even noticed when a person whose heart was closed to kindness appeared nearby. At 23:50, an emergency call came in on the 999 line. At least 12 shots were fired in front of the pub entrance, with 2 of the bullets hitting Elle. One of them inflicted a serious head wound on the girl. The dispatcher quickly sent an ambulance and police to the scene. Medics urgently took the wounded Elle to the local hospital, but the girl died on the way from her injuries, which turned out to be incompatible with life. The news of Elle's tragic death came as a real shock to her family. Relatives could not believe or understand how this could happen to such a cheerful and charming girl. No one could even imagine that someone might wish Elle dead and become her mortal enemy. In the initial stages of the investigation, the detectives had no leads. The killer unexpectedly appeared at the crime scene, carried out the attack, and just as suddenly disappeared, leaving only shell casings and wounded victims behind. Everything indicated that, although unexpected, the shooting was carefully planned. Elle was at the epicenter and had no chance of being saved. However, it is still unclear whether the girl was really the attacker's target or perhaps turned out to be an accidental victim of armed madness. An unknown car stopped near the entrance to the pub, and within minutes, shots rang out from there. In addition to Elle, 4 more men received gunshot wounds of varying severity. They were all young visitors to the establishment, aged 22 to 33, who lived in nearby neighborhoods. Initially, investigators assumed that the deceased girl could have been an accidental victim. After all, it was known that clashes between local criminal groups sometimes occurred in that area. So it was quite possible that the shooting was connected with another gangster showdown. However, these were only guesses that had to be carefully checked during the investigation. To do this, the detectives began to study the identity of the victim in more detail. Elle's father, Tim, was shocked by the tragic events. Just a few hours before her death, he had spoken with his daughter on the phone. They had a nice conversation, with Tim telling Elle about how he was packing Christmas gifts for the family. The girl's relatives, like the witnesses to the crime, could not even imagine who might have wished Elle dead. It seemed that she had no ill-wishers or enemies who would be capable of such a horrible act. Investigators decided to interview other eyewitnesses and victims of the mysterious criminal's bullets. In addition, law enforcement officials asked the pub owner to provide footage from the surveillance cameras. After all, they had to interview dozens of people and watch hours of video footage. A whole group of police officers worked in Old Swan, tasked with conducting a large-scale investigation. They had to find answers to several difficult questions. Why did so many random people get hurt? Was the attack a spontaneous outburst of aggression, or did the criminal have a specific target after all? Law enforcement officers thoroughly interrogated all witnesses to the event, but checking the details of the telephone connections took the most time. The media was involved in the investigation to encourage citizens who had valuable information to contact the police station. First of all, the investigators were interested in possible video recordings from the crime scene made by random witnesses, because they could have captured the car in which the shooter was moving. Shortly after the tragedy, the police held a meeting with local residents, hoping to find people among them who could share important data with the investigation. After all, someone might have seen the moment of the attack or recognized the criminal himself. Law enforcement officials urged people not to be afraid of threats from bandits or criminals and to boldly provide information. Community activists and opinion leaders supported the residents of Old Swan during this difficult time. They not only spoke at meetings, but also communicated with citizens face-to-face, visiting their homes. Specially trained police officers provided support and counseling to the relatives of the deceased girl, helping them cope with the heavy loss. Thanks to these efforts, it was established that the criminal disappeared from the scene in a dark car. Eyewitnesses described the make of the car differently, because due to the late hour and poor lighting, it was extremely difficult to make out properly. But most often a dark Mercedes A-Class was mentioned. This information was later confirmed by footage from external surveillance cameras. Before opening fire, the killer watched the visitors for some time, parking the car so that he had a good view of the entrance to the pub and most of the hall. Obviously, he was waiting for the most convenient moment to attack. When Elle walked out of the pub a few minutes later, the attacker quickly left the car, fired 12 shots at the girl and other people, then instantly returned to the car and disappeared in an unknown direction. After carefully studying the recordings, the investigators made an important conclusion: the attacker acted alone, without any accomplices. However, it was not yet possible to establish exactly where he went after the massacre. That is why law enforcement officers continued to go around local residents, describing in detail the appearance of the car and the circumstances of the crime. They hoped to come across witnesses who would help establish the identity of the killer. Patrols of the neighborhood continued around the clock, and soon brought the first results. Just 2 days after the tragedy, detectives detained 2 suspects, a 30-year-old man and a 19-year-old girl. Residents and the press were immediately informed about this, but without naming the names of the persons involved until all the circumstances were fully clarified. However, it was not possible to prove the involvement of these individuals in the murder, primarily because the weapon that was used to shoot Elle was not found during the search. So the police made an official statement assuring the public, law enforcement agencies will not rest until the unknown shooter is brought to justice. This was intended to appease the anger and indignation of local residents, who were extremely concerned about the rampant banditry and the inability of the authorities to counter it. One of the leading versions of the investigation remained the likely involvement of rival criminal groups fighting for control over the territory. In that case, Elle was considered an accidental victim of gangster showdowns. However, this assumption, like others, had yet to be carefully verified by investigators. Investigators dealing with the shooting at the Lighthouse pub found that the likely targets of the attacker could have been Jake Duffy and Kieran Seld, members of a local criminal gang who were relaxing at the establishment that evening. It turned out that both men were involved in a prolonged violent conflict with a rival gang trying to take control of their territory. On December 29, another suspect fell into the hands of the police, but he turned out to be unrelated to the shooting. The man had a reliable alibi that completely excluded him from the list of potential attackers. However, the detective suspected that the detainee could have been involved in a conspiracy, the purpose of which was the armed attack. Around the same time, law enforcement officers identified the vehicle used by the shooter. It turned out to be a dark Mercedes. However, due to the lack of direct evidence, the name of the third person involved in the investigation was not yet disclosed. The process of searching for the car was accompanied by certain difficulties. At first, the police managed to track the car thanks to the city's video surveillance systems and cameras. However, when the squad arrived at the specified location, there was no one there. It turned out that law enforcement officers were late by literally a few minutes. On December 31, the duty officer received a report of a fire that occurred near the scene of the shooting. Experts who arrived at the call saw a dark Mercedes engulfed in flames, which matched the description of the criminal's car. Unfortunately, the fire completely destroyed the vehicle, and with it, valuable evidence. It appeared that the bandits, realizing that the police were already on their trail, decided to destroy one of the most significant clues. Despite the fact that only ashes remained of the car, the investigators still managed to confirm its direct involvement in the attack on the pub. It also turned out that the Mercedes was stolen by the attackers shortly before the crime. So the arson of the car apparently became a way to confuse the investigation and get rid of traces after the massacre of competitors. On January 11, two more suspects in the case were brought to the police station, a 22-year-old young man and his 23-year-old girlfriend. Both were detained in Central Wales. The young man's name was Connor Chapman, and this name was well known to local law enforcement. After all, in the 5 years leading up to the murder of Elle Edwards, he had managed to acquire an impressive criminal record. Connor started with petty offenses, but over time he got deeper and deeper into the criminal environment. One of the first serious crimes on his track record was car theft under aggravating circumstances. Subsequently, the young man repeatedly appeared in cases of robbery, hooliganism and threats. Once the guy even ran away from a police chase. He abandoned the stolen car and tried to hide in the bushes nearby. When the cops finally caught up with Chapman, he pretended to be uninvolved, claiming that he was just waiting for a friend and did not understand what chase they were talking about. This incident brought the young repeat offender his first fame. His name appeared on the pages of local newspapers. Journalists even conducted a small investigation into Connor's biography. It turned out that he was born in Birkenhead, a suburb of Liverpool. His parents abandoned the boy in early childhood, so his grandparents took care of raising their grandson. They sheltered Connor in their home. Already in his teens, the future gangster began to show a tendency to antisocial behavior. He dropped out of school shortly before the final exams, although he had been studying extremely poorly before that. Teachers did not place any special hopes on him and unanimously considered him a problem student. Chapman first appeared in the dock in 2014, when he turned 14. At that time, the young man was accused of theft from a store. And already in 2016, he again appeared before the court, this time for car theft. Connor was detained in a stolen car, while he had neither a license nor insurance, which further aggravated his guilt and violated the conditions of his early release. 2017 brought new troubles with the law. In addition to the usual car theft, possession of prohibited substances was added. At this time, the guy was officially under police supervision, so he violated the terms of his probation for the second time. As a result, he was banned from appearing in several parts of the city at once. The ban also applied to visiting public places, because even then the young man posed an obvious threat to others. But the very next year, 2018, Garner ignored all the prescriptions. Patrol officers detained him on a busy street, while a folding knife and a bag of prohibited substance were found in the offender's pocket. Around the same time, Chapman's name first appeared in the headlines of regional media, after his unsuccessful attempt to escape from the police in a stolen car. It happened like this: a squad car noticed a stolen Audi on the road and ordered the driver to stop and get out with his hands up. Instead, 18-year-old Garner pressed the gas pedal and rushed to escape. During the short chase, the offender managed to cause a lot of trouble. He drove the speedometer needle over 80 miles per hour in a 30 zone, repeatedly drove into the oncoming lane, and at the end, lost control and crashed into the curb. The impact spun the car around and threw it onto the shoulder. However, even this did not stop Chapman. Abandoning the battered car, he ran away, but was caught by patrolmen in the bushes a couple of hundred meters from the crash site. In court, the lawyer tried to justify his client, claiming that he simply fell under the influence of bad company. They say that older friends dragged the inexperienced young man into crime. The defender insisted on Chapman's innocence, demanding that he be released. During the process, an expert hired by the lawyer diagnosed the guy with attention deficit disorder and a number of related disorders. However, the court found such arguments insufficient and, given the aggravating circumstances and the potential danger of Garner to society, sent him to a juvenile detention center for 8 months. The young man was also banned from driving a car for several years after his release. Thus, even before reaching the age of majority, Chapman managed to earn 14 convictions for more than 30 criminal episodes. It became obvious that he was not going to take the path of correction. On the contrary, he deliberately ignores any attempts by the authorities to return him to the legal field. Despite the fact that everyone around understood how dangerous this young man was to others, no purely legal grounds were found for completely isolating Garner from society. The fact is that none of his antics had yet led to serious casualties or injuries. Impunity only inflamed the young criminal. Therefore, the public and journalists were extremely outraged by the leniency of the sentences and the obvious impotence of justice. It seemed that representatives of the criminal world were allowed everything, until they commit premeditated murder or cripple one of the reckless witnesses. And so it happened. In January 2020, Garner again found himself in the dock, this time receiving a 10-month sentence. The cops detained him in a crowded place with cold weapons and prohibited substances in his pockets, and this despite the fact that at the time of the arrest, the young man had a whole range of prescriptions and prohibitions. During that period, law enforcement officers even appeared on television, urging local residents to beware of Garner and report his movements. Having barely been released, Chapman went on a rampage again. He began to be wanted immediately for several episodes in which the young man was the main person involved. Upon the next detention, Garner pretentiously declared that he had spent more time behind bars than at large. And, most interestingly, he said this without any regret or remorse, clearly proud of such achievements. However, the young repeat offender clearly did not intend to stop there. By his 20th birthday, he again got a solid stack of criminal cases. At that time, Chapman already had 19 convictions for more than 40 criminal episodes, among which were robberies, thefts, threats, disobedience to the police and possession of prohibited substances. But in the summer of 2022, the desperate young man managed to get out again, and this is only 6 months before the tragic death of Elle Edwards. Almost immediately, Chapman appeared before another court. This time, his lawyer, appealing to the feelings of the jurors, said that Garner's first child was born while he was serving his sentence. Desperately trying to evoke pity from the judges, the lawyer reported that the suspect's girlfriend was pregnant again. Allegedly, in between serving time, the young father rethought his life and sincerely intends to take the path of correction. Of course, all this was just beautiful but empty words. The only thing Chapman aspired to was to be at large as soon as possible in order to continue his usual criminal lifestyle. At that time, the police already knew for sure that Garner had joined one of the local gangs that was engaged in the distribution of prohibited substances. However, Chapman was not brought to court for his activities as part of the group, but for more down-to-earth crimes, such as robbing a house and stealing 2 electric motorcycles. And on December 24, 2022, an event occurred that became the catalyst for the bloody drama in the pub. 2 rival gangs clashed with each other, not sharing the territory near a wooden church in Beechwood Acres. Negotiations reached an impasse, and one of the young men decided to take revenge on his opponents. Arming himself with a Scorpion submachine gun, he waited about 3 hours for his victims, Kieran Seld and Jake Duffy. The bandit knew that in the evening they would visit the Lighthouse pub to have fun. Shortly before midnight, the attacker parked near the establishment and began to watch the entrance. Recognizing both men, he waited for the right moment and jumped out of the car, releasing a whole burst of 12 bullets towards the doors. Duffy received several serious wounds, but luckily he survived. But Elle Edwards, who was in no way involved in the gangster showdowns, was much less fortunate. 2 bullets hit the girl in the head at once. The beauty desperately clung to life, but all the efforts of the doctors were in vain. She died on the way to the hospital. Elle did not even suspect that a chance meeting with 2 visitors to the pub would turn into a real tragedy for her and ruin plans for a fun celebration. The Lighthouse was crowded with people, so 4 more people were injured by the shooter. A 22-year-old guy was shot in the leg, a 24-year-old man was shot in the arm, and a 33-year-old visitor was shot in the wrist. Fortunately, none of these injuries were life-threatening. The deceased girl's friends tried to provide her with first aid before the medics arrived, performing artificial respiration. But unfortunately, all efforts were in vain. But Elle's sister, Lucy, was incredibly lucky. Literally a few minutes before the shooting, she left the pub. The girl lived in Dubai and had just flown home that day to celebrate Christmas with her family. Later, Lucy repeatedly recalled that she suggested her sister go with her, but she decided to linger with the company. Elle's friends said that the shots were so sudden that at first they were mistaken for the sounds of fireworks. On January 25, 2023, hundreds of townspeople came to see Elle Edwards on her final journey. The coffin with her body was delivered to the church in a hearse drawn by 4 white horses. As a sign of mourning and respect for the memory of the deceased girl, the Lighthouse pub, which became the place of her last celebration, closed its doors on the day of the funeral. The owners of the establishment posted words of sympathy and support for Elle's family on social media pages. Garner Chapman was charged with a whole range of charges, the key one being premeditated murder. It also turned out that he had an accomplice, 20-year-old Thomas Nord. When the latter was detained, a video recording made shortly before the massacre was found in his home. In it, Chapman was bragging about weapons, stating that he had to deal with certain people. Shortly after the carnage, both young men hid the stolen Mercedes used by the killer. However, the submachine gun that was used to shoot the pub visitors was never found. But investigators were able to detect Garner's DNA on several shell casings from the crime scene. This proved that it was Chapman who loaded the weapon before the attack. Another telling detail was the red gloves seized by the cops during a search of the main suspect's home. It was in such gloves that the attacker was when he shot up the pub. This is clearly visible in the footage from external surveillance cameras. In addition, traces of Chapman's DNA were also found on them, which linked him to the bloody events of that evening. After abandoning the Mercedes after the shooting, the young men called a taxi under a fictitious name, to cover their tracks and throw the police off. And already around 5 in the morning they returned to the place where they left the car. However, instead of the usual cleaning up of traces, the attackers decided to burn the vehicle. Something in their plan went wrong, and as a result, only ashes remained of the car. In the end, Thomas Nord was found guilty on all counts and in July 2023 was sentenced to 9 years in prison. The relatively light sentence was explained by the fact that his criminal record was much thinner than that of his older comrade. Jake Duffy and Kieran Seld, although injured during the attack, managed to survive. Given their lifestyle, the reasons for the aggression from the hostile gang seemed quite understandable. Both men belonged to a local gang formation known as the Beechwood Boys. It openly feuded with competitors, dividing up territories for the sale of prohibited substances. By the way, the day before the shooting at the pub, on December 23, 2023, Duffy and Seld had already become targets for attack. Then they were brutally beaten by one of Connor Chapman's henchmen. Although neither of the authorities suffered serious injuries, it still should have been a wake-up call for them. But instead, both men regarded the incident as an accidental fight and the next evening went carefree to have fun at their favorite pub. While Elle Edwards' killer was awaiting sentencing, his potential victims, Kieran Seld and Jake Duffy, were already behind bars. Seld was sentenced to 27 months in prison for assaulting members of a rival gang, and later another 9 months were added to his sentence for fighting. His friend, Duffy, received 2 years and 9 months for similar crimes. The reason for such aggressive behavior was apparently an attempt to take revenge on rivals for the ambush. In addition to the main punishment, the court issued a number of prohibitions and restrictions to both criminals. However, such methods in no way guaranteed the safety of ordinary citizens from the tyranny of criminal gangs. Unless, in the event of further violations, this would allow tougher sanctions to be applied to repeat offenders. The excessive leniency of sentences and the ineffectiveness of court orders outraged the public. It seemed that the justice system was powerless against criminal elements, allowing them to get off with minimal terms time after time, while ordinary people felt unprotected. A telling example was the fact that at the time of the pub shooting, Connor Chapman was already banned from appearing in that part of the city. However, this did not prevent him from stealing a car, coming to the establishment and arranging a shooting there, although he was also deprived of a driver's license. The tragedy at the lighthouse once again put the issue of the effectiveness of punishments and the revision of existing legislative norms on the agenda. However, as of today, no tangible progress has been made in this area. At the trial in the case of Elle's murder, the defendant tried to convince the court that the video recordings from surveillance cameras were not him. Chapman claimed that at the time of the shooting he was at home, packing Christmas gifts. However, the evidence collected was quite enough to expose his lie. The court hearings lasted 3.5 weeks. During this time, all the circumstances that preceded the armed attack surfaced. In particular, the investigation established that the only motive for the massacre was the rivalry of two gangs for spheres of influence. It also turned out that Chapman was not even acquainted with his accidental victim and the girl's fate did not bother him at all, like that of other visitors to the pub. The only thing that guided the attacker was blind rage, which he was unable to curb. Immediately after the assassination attempt on his competitors, Connor was going to flee to Spain to cover his tracks. He managed to get rid of the pistol he fired from and burned the stolen Mercedes. Trying not to fall into the hands of the police, the bandit moved around the city on foot or used public transport. The escape plan nearly worked. Connor was detained literally before boarding a flight at the airport. During interrogations, Chapman tried to mislead the investigation, claiming that the car seen near the pub at the time of the shooting was not actually stolen. Instead, according to him, it was a working car of the gang, which the attackers used to transport prohibited substances. The suspect insisted that he himself was not driving that evening and did not shoot at the establishment. Chapman desperately tried to come out dry. He stated that he burned the Mercedes as soon as he learned about its use by his accomplices during the attack. Before the jury went to the deliberation room, the father of the innocently killed Elle addressed them with a speech. The bereaved man expressed the hope that the accused would never be able to meet Christmas with his family at large until the end of his days. After listening to all the arguments of the parties and discussing them, 5 men and 7 women jurors reached a unanimous decision in 3 hours. They found Connor Chapman guilty on all counts. In their opinion, the young man cynically shot the visitors of the pub and did not repent at all that he took the life of a beautiful 26-year-old girl who had everything ahead of her. Instead of repenting for what he had done, Chapman spent several days carefully destroying all evidence of his involvement in the bloody crime. The only motive for the attack was competition between local criminal groups. On July 7, 2023, Connor Chapman was sentenced, life imprisonment with the right to parole no earlier than 48 years later. Upon hearing the court's decision, Elle's father, not holding back his emotions, raised his fist in the air as a sign of victory. The brutal massacre that took the life of an innocent girl shook the entire community. City residents felt defenseless, because they were unwittingly drawn into the confrontation of criminal clans that divided the territory. Realizing that the bandits had a lot of illegal weapons in their hands, people were afraid to find themselves in the line of fire at any moment, as happened with Elle Edwards. The father of the deceased announced his intention to create a fund to help the families of victims of similar crimes. The main mission of the organization was to be the fight for strengthening control over the circulation of weapons among the civilian population. The man, devastated by the tragedy, expressed the hope that the senseless death of his daughter would become a lesson for everyone and a warning for the future. If it saves at least one innocent life, our Elle did not die in vain, he told the press. Please write your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. For those who are new here, subscribing is the best way to stay updated on future content. Also give a like please. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Thank you for your support during this difficult time. Until next time, friends.